So, hello, Richard. And I've got bad lighting on me, but we can deal with that. How are you?
Hi, Vlad. I'm doing great.
And whereabouts in the world are you today?
So I'm in a small community just north of Detroit in Michigan in the U.S.
Okay. Oh, so it's full winter for where you are, a bit like in London.
Yeah, yeah. There's snow all over.
So, look, you have a really interesting background, but before we dive into the conversation and kind of get full context, could you explain a little to me about who you are, your background? Because it's quite varied.
Yeah, I've been around a little bit because I went to school to study aerospace engineering, thinking that back then we'd be colonizing the moon by the '80s. That didn't happen, so I went into automotive, and I've had two distinct careers. And the first one was 11 years as a automotive structural analyst. So I was basically doing the crash worthiness on car seats and things like that. And then in '93, discovered the internet, as many people did, and just totally did an about face and went into the networking world and started an ISP. And that,
You started an ISP.
yeah, I started RustNet, one of the first ISPs in Michigan.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah,
I feel like, yeah, okay.
yeah, and that was just an intensive 12 months learning curve to get up on that. And that led, of course, to security. And I had various roles at PricewaterhouseCoopers and then finally Gartner. And I think Gartner was when all of a sudden I discovered my calling, such as it is. And in recent years, I've gone back and I said, what do I want to do when I grow up? And I realized I enjoy two things: speaking publicly, so giving presentations, and writing. And being an industry analyst, as I was at Gartner, gave me that opportunity. And I've just tried to sculpt everything I do around those two things, and it's working.
Okay. So essentially, you do, I mean, I think the term is Infosec, right? So you
Correct. Yeah,
talk about internet security, you give advice about it. And also, you, in recent years, studied warfare and politics as well. Is that right?
that's correct. Yeah. And that was spawned by the fact that in 2008, I was, fairly newly independent, and I was getting advice actually from somebody who interviewed me in Halifax for a documentary he was doing on cybercrime. And all he ended up using was a 30-second soundbite, but we talked for an hour. And at the end of the hour, he says, "Wow, have you written a book on this?" And that sparked the idea that, hey, maybe I should write a book. And I wrote a book on cyber warfare that was published in 2010. And as I was writing it, I realized I was drawing on my interest in military history, but probably coming off as fairly sophomoric, right? Because I had no academic backing at all. I'm an engineer. So I decided to go back to school, went to King's College, and got a master's in war in the modern world.
That's King's College in London.
Correct, yeah. And it was easily the hardest thing I'd ever done was taking that class. I thought going into it that I was a writer. I'd written these books. I've been writing columns for years, and I could not get a good grade on any essays I submitted. And even all the way up to the time I graduated, and I was getting grades of 60 or 64 on these essays that I poured everything into. And only after I graduated did somebody tell me, "Well, you idiot, that's a good grade in England." they, they don't grade on a curve, they grade really hard. So,
Oh,
what,
wow. Okay.
but it helped motivate me to keep trying harder and harder, but it was hard.
Okay, I get it. Do you know, and I feel your story as well. Part of the reason why I'm doing this documentary is similar conversation where I try and explain what's happening around tech, and people just weren't getting it because I think right now there are lots of people who are in tech or in finance talking about it, but are not exploring the wider areas. So, really what I want to try and get here and kind of get my head around, and I guess in a way I'm playing the innocent in this journey, so not the expert, because I don't think, I was discussing with a friend, I don't think that to a large extent the journalistic heavy lifting has been done. So all we can do is try and take a look around and see what's happening. But we're really interested in what's happening kind of transformatively, I guess. So rather than things that are incrementally different, things that will be dramatically different. And I think part of that is cyber warfare. Part of that is security. So on a national level, on a sovereign level, on a kind of finance level, on a personal level. And I know your background is really fascinating in that. So I'm looking forward to hopefully understanding a little more at the end of this conversation. So maybe kind of diving in a bit more, what's the thing that worries you the most right now? What's the thing do you think people are blind to?
Yeah, we are blind to the unknown, as you would expect, but we don't think about it often enough to expect the unknown. We've been exposed to it over and over. In security, there's this constant, oh my gosh, that's the wake up call. You hear it, once every 3 or 4 months from people. This changes everything, and it's always the threat actors advancing their game. And
who do you mean by threat actors?
So threat actors are the bad guys, the hackers. Actually they fall into several categories. It could be just an insider, a disgruntled employee. It could be a cyber criminal who wants to make a bunch of money. And you can watch, cyber criminals are the easiest to watch, right? Because they have to engage in public forums, and you can see the evolution of their attacks. And it's like a market economy. If one person demonstrates, how Bitcoin can change cybercrime, right? Because now you can engage in extortion online and be fairly confident that you can get away with it because the money is kind of anonymous. Or they, discover ransomware, and oh my gosh, this is great. We can spread ransomware via botnets, and it keeps going.
And am I right in thinking that some of these players are also freelancing for governments? So it's not necessarily they're different people; they're the same people working for different people.
Yeah, for sure. You go where the opportunity is, and maybe are politically motivated. We've certainly seen that in in Russia, starting with Chechnya versus Russia, which kind of predates the things we hear about today, but was some of the first hacking.
So explain what's that story? What happened in Chechnya?
Yeah, so you remember Chechnya was essentially trying to break away from post-Soviet Union Russia. There are a lot of horrible things going on, but there's also hacking going on. And Chechens hacked email servers in NATO, for instance, and blasted them with denial of service attacks, etc.
What year was this?
Oh gosh, we're talking the 90s.
Okay. Oh,
yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So it was before people had websites that you could DDoS or deface. So that was, to put a peg in the ground, that was the beginning. Even though I think 1998 is the first example that Dorothy Deming gives of cyber terrorism, where some Tamil Tigers, who were, like you said, they were hackers, but also associated with the insurgents in Sri Lanka. They mail bombed the Sri Lankan embassies around the world. Mail bombing back then was just send a bunch of large emails to a mail server and it would crash.
Okay.
Those were the days before mail server became Google or Microsoft.
So, okay, and going to more recent times, I think looking at, what's covered in the book that came out in 2015, and remind me what the title of that book was?
Yeah, it's There Will Be Cyber War.
There Will Be Cyber War. So what are the areas, where did that story start for you?
Yeah, so here I am going back to school and get my master's. It took me about 3 years. And early in, I started asking the professors, if I should continue on to get my PhD. You think about that. Now you've got the prerequisites. All you need is, $100,000 to go the next stage. And it was funny because the professors would say, well, not here, because here at King's College, there's nobody who can teach you about cyber. And this sounds a little like I'm full of myself, but my response was, I don't need anybody to teach me about cyber. I need somebody to teach me about what's called strategic studies, right? How the world works, especially between great powers. So interestingly enough, in the 3 years it took me to graduate, 4 professors at King's College wrote books on cyber war.
Oh, wow.
One of them, Thomas Rid, wrote an anti-cyber war book called There Is No Cyber War. So thus the title of my book. And I made sure he wasn't my advisor for my master's thesis. So so anyways, as we're going through the course, there was no cyber, though I look at everything through a lens of cyber and cyber conflict. And that's when I was exposed to what used to be the top study in academia for warfare, which was the Revolution in Military Affairs. So an RMA, and it was this theory that a change in technology or organization or processes would change the way wars are fought. It's a big debate whether the change comes first and then the technology catches up. But regardless, up to the time the United States invaded Afghanistan, RMA was the hot academic topic. So I dug into that and realized that the RMA that they talked about was the move on the part of primarily the U.S. military to something called network-centric warfighting, which is simply the exact same thing I'd gone through in '93, and many of us had at that time. Oh my gosh, this internet's going to change the world. There was an admiral who was in charge of the IT systems for the U.S. Pacific 7th Fleet, who had that moment, it was the eureka moment where he realized the internet was changing everything, and he wanted to network his fleet. And he did. He went in, and when he became in charge of the fleet, he went in and tore out all the systems and replaced them all with Windows 95 because it had a networking stack, and commandeered some Inmarsat satellites so he could connect to AOL. AOL was the backbone of the Pacific, and he did all that, and the repercussions that went on from there were that the military sought to network all of their intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability. So satellites and drones and spy planes and all the rest, somehow networked together into this global information grid, and also network command and control, so that you'd have what Andrew Marshall, the Yoda of the Pentagon, called this centralized, decentral command and control, so that the commander in the field would have complete situational awareness. On his screen or his VR goggles, he could see the red team and blue team, so they don't actually accidentally shoot at the wrong people. So this beautiful, beautiful vision, which they continued to execute on.
Beautiful vision with the AOL as a backbone.
Well, they eventually created their own network and started. Well, we hope they've encrypted that network, but
I'm diving in there quickly. What's been happening? All the crashes of the U.S. Navy fleet. And that was the Pacific Fleet as well, I believe.
Yeah.
Is there a connection there?
Well, good question. So I just taught a course on cyber warfare in Australia remotely, like this. And I left it as a question at the end of covering this thesis of military unpreparedness. What purpose could be served by hacking into all these ships in the fleet and causing them to be damaged, right? Because you damage a naval vessel and it is out of commission for years. First, they have to determine what happened, and there's an inquiry, and somebody gets court-martialed or fired. And then finally, they get around to getting the budget to fix the ship and get it out there. So we're talking degradation of capability in an arena that China doesn't want us to be playing in, and they make that pretty obvious. So I have to leave it as a question because the Navy has said it was not technical. It was just, bad management, etc. But come on, they've got all this equipment. They do have people on deck looking over the side. How could it happen the 5 or 6 times that we know of?
Yeah, I think that's the hard thing that I find challenging right now is working out, when does paranoia stop and kind of sensible skepticism start? It's
Yep. And in my field in cybersecurity, paranoia really, really helps. And the best cyber defenders are the paranoid ones. It takes a certain mindset to either be a good hacker on the red team or the blue team side. And everything that you could imagine happening happens. It's outrageous. Which brings up the one thing that hasn't happened in the United States, anyways, is the Leon Panetta Cyber Pearl Harbor, which is this idea that all critical infrastructure will be attacked and disrupted and taken down for months at a time, and transformers will blow up that are only manufactured in China and India, and it'll take 2 years to get back up, put us back in the dark ages.
That's what people call a black swan event, right?
They could, except that black swan events are completely unexpected.
Okay.
Whereas this one is completely predicted. Everybody in the world predicts that this will happen, and for good reason. All those systems are completely vulnerable, and nobody's doing anything to protect them. It's frustrating being the person. I and many other people have to do this, saying you got to fix your systems and make sure you're not connected to the internet and deploy all these security controls. And for the most part, power grids and many communication grids have a hand in glove relationship with local government, right? The utilities are the rates they charge are determined by a government body, etc. So if you ask them to do more, they say, yeah, you're right, we really should, give us more money. And that's never an appropriate response when the things you could do actually don't cost more money, right? It just means doing a better job of what you're supposed to be doing. And when you think of the liabilities, so most power utilities are not liable for deaths if the power goes out, right? Because that would just be a huge, huge liability. If a hospital system is without power, or my mother-in-law's oxygen machine doesn't work, they can't accept that liability. So they're granted a waiver on that liability. But at some point, I think if it's truly their fault, it's one thing to talk about acts of God, hurricanes and ice on branches. Completely another thing to say, what, we are just negligent and never looked at black energy, which is a piece of malware coming out of Russia, on our networks. And it's everywhere.
Okay, so look, I just want to, we're kind of free ranging, which is great, but I want to make sure we cover off stuff. So in terms of the players, we're talking national governments, we're talking one-off criminals, we're talking criminal organizations, and are we also talking corporate entities? Like people were doing, I guess, in terms of hacking into other businesses?
Yeah, sure. It is most evident in Asia right now. So especially, you got a small online store, does $100 an hour in revenue, and it's got a competitor who's spending more for Google AdWords maybe. So they hire somebody for $100 to take down the competitor's website. And that immediately they get all their money back because their sales go up because people can't get to their competitor. So that's in a world, that is completely unacceptable in most places, to hire somebody to take out your
same as mafia in New York in the 1920s, shaking down shops and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So, but on a large scale, you could see that happening, and more subtle kind of things going on, especially adopting the nation state cyber espionage techniques to get information on your competitors, because it's perfectly legitimate to collect competitive information. Where you cross the line is, where you attempt to read your competitor's email and actually hack into them to get that. And there are instances of that going on, but it's not widespread yet. But, some of these companies, Uber comes to mind, have tremendous access to data and can misuse it. If you think about it, we trust Google an awful lot. Google can read all of your email. And I've tested it, right? I've put up a site not even at a domain name, just at a IP address, and then in an email send a link to it to somebody, and sure enough, next thing you know, a Google bot is scanning your website
Oh,
because they
wow.
because
Okay.
they harvest what's in that email. Now, I still don't believe that people read your emails and try and discover your private life, but there's a machine there that is reading all of your email on Gmail.
Okay. So look, we'll go ahead, talk about the future in a minute, and I know you've been writing about 5G as well. Touch on cyber defenders. Now, I know the only thing I've read about this is the US government having problems because most hackers are stoners, and the US government won't hire stoners to do cyber defense. Can you talk to me a little around what's happening on the defense side?
Yeah, so we had a dichotomy inside the Pentagon, and because it is oriented towards attack and strategizing around attack, and during the famous Buckshot Yankee program, where they're basically cleaning up a worm that had gone rampant inside the networks, the NSA took a top role in finding that worm, blocking it, getting the Pentagon to recover from it. And that division of the NSA eventually was elevated to U.S. Cyber Command, all on the offensive side. And even the part that is supposed to be the defensive side, the Software Assurance Directorate, was eventually dissolved and folded into the offensive side, the Signals Intelligence Directorate. So SIG and SAD. So they don't have a defensive mentality, especially since defense costs money that you can't justify with this program, right? So you go to President Bush Jr. and you say, hey, we want to spend $20 million and we're going to develop an attack methodology against Iran's nuclear or uranium refineries. You get money for it. You go to them and you say, hey, we're worried that out of our 3.5 million users of computers, some of them might be installing USB thumb drives to steal data. To patch 3.5 million machines and bring them up to speed with what we call device control, they probably would have asked for $100 million or $500 million to do that with no immediate result other than you've reduced risk a little bit. Now, mind you, because they never even attempted to do that level of cyber defense, we had both Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden, who both used that methodology to take data from the NSA.
So in a way, they should be taking the blame for having their systems so open that could
completely, especially when they supposedly have the security mindset. And I always like to raise a point, when they talk about Edward Snowden being the greatest security breach in the history of anything. I like, wait a minute, there are 30,000 employees at the NSA who all have the access Edward Snowden does. And you're telling me none of them work for Russia or China, let alone Israel and our purported friends?
Would just tell you that would have to be the case, wouldn't it?
It has to be. The numbers in history tells you that. So therefore, why don't you have compartmentalization and these strict security controls? And in a bank, if you go to one today, or a tech company, they can tell you who's downloading what to what devices. They know that, and that's 10-year-old technology.
Yeah.
So we know best practices, and we know the NSA isn't following them.
Okay, that's really interesting. Do you think also that the corporate world are doing their own defenses, and are you aware of what the police are doing in terms of putting up cyber defenses? I mean, do they investigate crimes rather than stop crimes happening?
Yeah, that's, I think, safe to say. Same motivations, right? We want to get the cool toys, and we want to, spy on people in internet relay chat forums. We want to do all this stuff, but just because somebody's talking about committing a crime doesn't mean a crime has been committed. So they rather than stop it from happening, they wait till it's happened and then they go back and try and gather evidence. Corporate, I think, is way ahead of anybody else, way ahead of universities, definitely way ahead of police departments and state and local governments, and most militaries around the world. They've had to deal with these level of attacks for so long. So, for instance, probably the best prepared and the one with the best cyber defense is Lockheed Martin. And in my first book, I take you all the way back to about 2003, because that's when they were the subject of espionage attacks labeled Titan Rain at the time by the FBI. And it was just hundreds of the defense facilities, owned by cyber espionage that is attributed to China at the time. So from 2003 to the famous 2010 attack, where an attacker used one-time password tokens that they had somehow reverse engineered and spoofed to try and log into Lockheed remotely. And Lockheed caught them and stopped them.
Oh,
so
wow.
To date, the best example of effective cyber defense.
Okay, and all right, so we've spoken about some of the players. Kind of bring it forward a little bit. I know in your book you spoke about China or the PLA. We've mentioned about Russia. Who are the scariest players for you, and could you talk around what your thoughts are around those countries?
Yeah, so China from a military perspective, because China is, to me, on a global scale, China is most interested in expanding their sphere of influence through more traditional methodologies, right? Having aircraft carriers, colonizing islands in the South China Sea near the Philippines, something that almost fits a Cold War mentality of how you do extension of your power. And I think they will use sophisticated electronic warfare, hacking into systems to help them in their future battles if they encounter the U.S. or sophisticated military.
Am I right in thinking that because they've got such a large economy and they're so plugged into the global economy that their motivation isn't necessarily about screwing things up, it's just to have more power for themselves?
Yeah, you really have to step back and look at their long-term plan, which, is 100 years, right? Which is to dominate the world economically and intellectually. So small steps for them don't necessarily mean gaining more power, right? Because their economy is so dependent on the global economy, they would want to ensure stability in that global economy. So they don't want any one other player to be too disruptive in doing that. And don't forget, China's main concern, like most large autocracies, is internal. So if their economy ever tanks, and there's never been an economy that didn't tank, in modern history anyway. Oh, never been, period. And China's has not. It's pretty amazing.
All right, so this is me thinking aloud, trying to create an analogy. So tell me if I'm wrong. Is China operating a bit like politics in World War One? Bunch of guys with cigars in back rooms trying to make things happen right for them. Whereas perhaps Russia, and I'm guessing here, it is more the scrappy kid that has nothing to lose and is just trying to screw stuff up to shakes out and try and take advantage of what's left behind.
A little bit, though. I don't imagine China as being, to me, China is bureaucracy writ large. So it's people actually thinking about how to do stuff and then slowly changing things so that what they want is accomplished. Russia, you can't help but think of the word thug, and it feels more like just a plutocracy and kleptocracy. But Russia, Russia doesn't have an economy in all sense of the word, right? They have an economy the way Saudi Arabia has an economy, right? They've got natural resources and they sell them into the world. But that's not like China or the United States, where it's more vibrant. We produce new things and create new things. So Russia is just messing with everybody to take them, lower them, in an effort to once again defend the internal position of Putin. Right, he gets to do that.
So in Russia, would you say there is less of a delineation between political cyber attacks and commercial cyber attacks?
Yeah, completely. The political is, it's almost like an industry that they support, right? Because there are a lot of people getting rich inside Russia. Now, rich is a relative term. A hacker from Russia, Romania, let's expand it to most of Eastern Europe. They can make $10,000 a month, which is an extraordinary amount of money, right? It makes them the richest person in their village, if that's the case. There are now billions of dollars being won by cyber criminals, so it's beginning to be a big industry. But also, the same tools can be turned to political purposes and to gain political favor. So if you are a cyber criminal organization that's really good at breaking into any targeted site you want to, then if you're asked, for instance, to gather as much information as you can on electoral bodies in the United States during the previous election, they can do that. They know exactly how to do it, and they can be very successful at it.
And I'm right in thinking also that there's this talk of, they do what they call asymmetric wars, where it's not a straight attack, but they attack you, but go, no, I didn't do that. So I guess an example would be invading the Ukraine, but saying it wasn't them.
Right.
And saying they're not involved in anything to do with the US election. So it's you don't quite know what to believe, because there's boots on the ground, but are there really boots on the ground? Is that a right assumption?
Yeah. It's a playbook way back from the Soviet Union era. The big lie, right? Just keep saying it over and over again, and you just create so much confusion, right? There's no difference between truth and lies, so you just put everything out there at once.
Okay, and that especially, I guess, works in cultures like in Europe and the US, where we're used to a level of truth in conversation.
Right. Yep. And it evidently it works inside Russia too.
All right, so look, I want to dive into a little bit there, because I guess I don't want to go too tabloid, and I don't want to come across that way. But equally, what I'm worried about is I kind of want to put up flags where people should be worried, or I want to put up flags where, like, hey, this is the great thing we can do to stop this happening or make our lives better. I guess doing a little bit of research, I'm vaguely aware of the Russian attacks, or what we assume are the Russian attacks, on Estonia and its infrastructure. And that was in 2009, right?
That was actually 2007, Estonia, and Georgia was 2008.
And do you think those kind of attacks can happen again? Could it happen in the US, where the power grid, I guess you said at the beginning, the power grid could get switched off? I'm thinking, I've just been watching Mr. Robot, actually season 2, and with banking taken down. Do you think there's a possibility that banking could go down, that power grids could go down in the US or in Europe?
Yeah, easily. Anytime. It just takes sufficient motivation. It would be, usually, you have to look at the motivation. Why would Russia do that? Well, maybe the timing would be just right to do that. There was a lot of chatter coming out of my sources in Israel that when at one point, I guess we were threatening to freeze accounts of Russian oligarchs. It was going back 3 or 4 years. The chatter was that Russia would turn on their best hackers to try and crash our markets. If they couldn't get access to their money, then nobody else could get access to it. And it's completely plausible. It's a Tom Clancy kind of theory, but completely plausible, as is an attack on the power grid. We're now beyond the time where it's a hypothesis, right? Because 2 years ago, Christmas, A large portion of the Ukraine power grid was taken down by hackers. So it's happened. You talk to somebody in any other country in the world, they're going to go, yeah, but that was the Ukraine. That's not us. So they still have the blinders on. So, as far as tabloid and worrying, I don't think people should worry in the long run. I think the people responsible for systems should worry because their lives are going to get really complicated if they don't take action now.
Let me put it this way. So I'll come from the viewpoint then of what should citizens be aware of to keep on the tail of their representative and make sure things happen. And actually, whilst you answer that, I guess what I'm also thinking about is what are the attacks that aren't so full on, like that you might not realize you're happening, the equivalent of someone taking money out of your purse without you realizing it.
Right.
Could you talk around those subjects?
Yeah. So this might be a hot button, but all of the attacks that we're worried about, one, we've got the solution now. We just haven't deployed them. So, and we will after the attack. It's just human nature. We're not going to build up the levees until after the hurricane has flooded them. We're not going to require people to move off of floodplains until after the fact. So, and that's going to be the same way with the power grid. It's the same way with banking. You remember when Twitter first launched, it didn't require strong authentication for your accounts, and you could attempt to log in as many times as you want, so anybody could just run a script overnight and guess your password. It's only after the fact that people react, and we'll be able to do that. The one thing that we can't react to and fix is government regulation and legislation, right? So in a reaction to one of these events, Congress will get together and overnight they'll unanimously pass a bill requiring some silly thing that will restrict our ability to use the internet effectively. And it'll take dozens of years to correct that. In the meantime, they'll just add more and more restrictions, as will each country. So in my mind, the biggest worry for me is the mercantilization of the internet. So all of a sudden, it's everybody competing against everybody else, and we go to a U.S. internet and a Canada internet and a UK internet and Australia internet and a China internet, and they've got borders between them. And
one of the things I've been, I normally live in the US, but I'm back in London for a couple of months, and I've really noticed this trip how the regulation is completely diverging between EU regulations and US regulations in terms of data privacy.
Completely.
I mean, that's what you're talking about right now. It's beginning to happen, that the internet's kind of pulling apart.
Right. Exactly. And this has been going on since the treaty on cybercrime that the EU Commission put in place. And Russia and China said, we're not going to sign this because it, involves us giving up our sovereignty to allow law enforcement to cross borders. Whereas most internet citizens, at least coming out of the last decade, feel that the internet is a different thing. It's not part of a country, it's its own realm. And once we're on it, we're free within it across all borders. And we're working against that right now. And it's something that I fear.
Okay, so do you feel like one country is getting it more right, or one area is getting it more right than others?
I see pockets, Finland, who built digital privacy into their constitution. I hold them up. Trying to think of other good examples. The UK's got tremendous issues. They require now every ISP to record all of your web browsing, for only 12 months. But man, that is a horrible invasion of privacy, all in the name of.
Does this mean that the UK and to some extent the US, there's an element of kind of cyber authoritarianism, be it by national governments or be it by big corporations, or is that completely paranoid?
No, it's it's funny, the EU trusts the government but doesn't trust corporations. In the US, it's the opposite. We trust corporations. Google, we trust them with everything, but we don't trust our government. And it's only, through some very sneaky little executive orders and laws that we ended up with the surveillance state that we have. But don't forget that the surveillance state was put in place post 9/11 to prevent future intelligence failures, which of course we've had plenty of since. So obviously that's not working. Um, so I think in the U.S. we got the best chance of fighting that. We just have to be vigilant and ensure that continuous collection of all of our stuff does not go on the part of the government. I'm okay with Google having it. I'm not okay with Google opening a back door to the NSA so that they can Google our stuff.
Okay, yes, that also scares me, the fact that we put failure points into technology so that governments can take a look, which is scary.
Unacceptable. That just breaks the technology. The other part of mercantilism to keep your eye on is just good old-fashioned fear-mongering in order to protect U.S. companies from competition. And so the new Defense Authorization Act that is going into effect this week, I believe, has lines in there forbidding the U.S. federal government agencies from using Kaspersky antivirus software. And all I've seen is claims. I've never seen any evidence presented whatsoever that Kaspersky collects information for the FSB in Russia. So just making those claims isn't good enough in the security space. You've got to show evidence. Once you show evidence, fine. Now we got a problem. But an antivirus vendor is not going to risk a billion-dollar revenue company by doing that, right? It's just not going to be part of their business model. They weren't created to do that. And sure, in the future, the FSB can hold a gun to somebody's head and say, do it. That's always the case. But the flashback from that, the blowback, is that everyone in Europe can say, well, we're going to stop using Google and Apple, Yahoo, for whatever that still exists, because the federal government can put a backdoor in their systems and steal all of our data. And we know, thanks to Edward Snowden, that they did do that. It's called PRISM. And they actually did have access to all those systems. That is extremely damaging for what I would argue is the most critical component of the U.S. economy. I mean, going forward, we've kind of given up on manufacturing. We don't do very much mining and natural resources collection anymore. Technology is what the United States has to offer the world. And doing this, surveillance and data collection, all for countering terrorist attacks, is not going to be worth it.
Okay, so maybe focusing on something a bit more positive for a little while. I know you've written about 5G tech and how you need to put security in there. Obviously, a big motivation for this movie was blockchain, AI, big data. I'm hearing people talking to me about the blockchain and, apps using stuff like Golem, which is creating an internet that sits on various mobile phones, that we might have this new internet, this separate internet that can't be hacked. And what are your thoughts, like looking forward to 5 or 10 years, about what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing, what it might look like?
Yeah, so first of all, everything's going to change with 5G, because now you don't have your home Wi-Fi connected to a cable or piece of fiber coming into your house. You're connecting to a pole down the street, and you're getting tremendous speeds, theoretically beyond 70 gigabytes of internet connectivity, shared with everybody in the neighborhood, mind you, but that's plenty. When I started in an ISP, we had 1.5 megabytes of connection all the way to Chicago. Wow. And I resold that to thousands of end users, and nobody ever complained. It was great. So imagine having gigabytes of availability. When you go into the office, so it's a big, some corporate bank, you're trying to get to all of the applications that the corporation has already moved to the cloud. So you're getting on Salesforce, you're getting to your 401k plan, your human resource information system. They're all hosted in the cloud, and they're forcing you to go through their pokey little network connection. You're going to go, forget that. I'm getting there on my phone, and I'll tether my phone to my laptop, and I'll have brilliant speed, and I can watch my videos instead of working and all the rest of that. That's going to just change the security architecture layer that every corporation has been working towards for the last 15 years. So there's going to be all these new methods for securing that, and the phone company is going to be in a perfect place to make that available to you, right? They'll be able to basically filter all this network traffic in the cloud against threats, against inappropriate behavior, etc. So that's a huge change. You can sit back and just start thinking about how that works. I mean, your television is going to be 5G connected, right? You can move it to any room in the house and it still gets the same connectivity at plenty speed to deliver video.
So going back to what you said about, I guess, the whole internet really being on the cloud and nothing being locally, I guess one of the things that's come out to me, that's come out of this research so far, is that current internet pre-blockchain, you can just hack into one point of weakness to make something happen. Whereas if everything's up in the cloud and it's, I'm guessing, on the blockchain somehow, there's no one point of weakness. You'd need to attack a lot, basically, more than anyone can manage.
Yeah, completely distributed. Though I would argue right now you could severely disrupt Bitcoin mining, for instance, by shutting down China, where 40% of all Bitcoins are mined.
So potentially we're talking about China dominating the economy because they own most Bitcoin. So
yeah.
The reserve
they own most Bitcoin creation. I don't know if they were dumping them back into the market as quickly as they make them. And that's, China's got the ability to waste a lot of energy and do it in a ecological way.
In a way, these companies or countries are acting a little bit like businesses, and I guess doing that. So we're used to, I guess, communist countries or left-wing countries owning resources and having nationalized businesses. But they kind of do the same. They can maybe do the same on the internet, owning these new currencies, controlling these new currencies because they have so much of it.
Yeah, possibly. Okay. Now, the cool thing is, I'm excited about Bitcoin because of the original purpose, right? Financial cryptography, as we called it then. And certainly as it becomes more accepted, it's very exciting to me to have a currency that is completely transparent as far as transactions. And just think of all the cool things you can do. It's like you can have a lottery, which is illegal in most countries to do a private lottery, but everybody does it, right? It's called the numbers game in Detroit. And even in Detroit, when people are running these illegal lotteries, so they say, you could win $1,000 just buy these tickets. To get the transparency, they use the official state-run lottery to generate the winning numbers. It's kind of cool.
Oh, wow.
You could create a blockchain-based lottery where you could see every ticket that was purchased. You wouldn't know necessarily who, but you could also see the final transaction when the winner got 50% of the raffle. So you would finally have trust in independent lotteries. And I'm sure it's probably happening already.
There's an issue, again, a lot of the research I've been doing is telling me about kind of transparency for businesses, privacy for individuals. And, my parents are refugees and, I went to communist Poland a couple of times going back, and I saw the tools of an authoritarian state. Knowing what everyone's seeing, what you spent your money on and how you spent it is worrying. I mean,
sure.
There's an element of transparency. Can you talk to me around that?
Yeah, so we have that today because the credit card agencies have all that information. And presumably the government could get it if they wanted it. I used to think how when you study the Soviet Union, we know they had a completely controlled economy, right? They had rooms full of people to, every quarter or whatever the financial period was, determine the price of all their commodities. Even with tens of thousands of people involved in that, they could only manage 70 different prices. for different commodities. So now imagine a future where all transactions are through credit cards, and the government, a totalitarian government like that, could see all transactions all the time and know them instantaneously. They'd have a lot more knobs and buttons to push in order to
Or an AI
control,
to control it all and work it out.
or AI and work it out, which, yeah, maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. The beauty of the blockchain is, one is it adds privacy, right? So, even though an AI could figure out who you are based on your transaction history pretty easily, but you always have the ability to open a new wallet and become a new person with a new buying habit, which you can't do with credit cards
Okay.
without changing your name.
So it seems like what you're saying to me so far is the thing we should be worrying about the most is making sure the legislation is in place to make sure stuff should happen. So it's less about issues and individual players and more about building resilience. So do you know what, I don't want to talk too much, but I'm going back to
I just want to correct you. I'm saying the opposite.
Okay.
Ensure that there is no legislation, because the legislation won't be well thought out enough to be the right thing.
Okay.
So
Okay.
legislation that eliminates restrictions and controls, that's great. But most legislation is to add controls.
All right. So transparency in what goes on for us to see what's happening is maybe the best way forward. In fact, radical transparency is the answer.
Yeah, I'm highly in favor of radical transparency.
Okay. Oh, that's kind of interesting. All right. I hadn't expected that conclusion to come out of this conversation, but
yeah, even though, remember the Pirate Bay, right?
Yeah.
Whose motivating principle is information should be free and there shouldn't be any intellectual property rights. I'm not saying I agree with that, because I definitely believe in intellectual property rights. But I've always been intrigued by the movement and the ability to rally people around that's definitely a radical transparency.
Yeah, no, I'm talking to some people who are, I guess, associated with that area, and it's interesting for me being open, trying to work out that level of paranoia versus sensible advice for moving forward, which is why it's always interesting to get lots of different opinions. So radical transparency in terms of governance, transaction, what business are doing, that will allow people to judge it. And I guess intellectual property rights are important because as we move to a society where less people have jobs, your intellectual property or your data is perhaps your salary.
Right. Yeah. So, and the blockchain will help you monetize your data, right? So you eventually maybe you can get paid for, your buying habits, your credit card records. Maybe if the company collects that, sells it on, they have to pay you, for your data. It's only a few dollars, but maybe it's worth it to you.
Just a couple of questions. Do you think, and this is an out there question, do you think laws in the future might need to be written by AI that can react to what's going on and then kind of have some general principles they're guided by and kind of regulate on the fly? Or is that just too surreal a concept?
It would make a great beginning of a science fiction story. Great writing prompt, I guess. That's great.
Yeah.
Just like, remember the science fiction story where they used statistical analysis. The theory being that, because we always have averages and the vote ultimately is 49 to 51%, something like that. So statistically, they somehow figured out the person whose vote would represent the majority. And he was the only one who voted. I know there's a logical fallacy to that, but it's a good story.
And I think the thing that's interesting for me, and I don't know if anyone has an answer, and I think I can probably only explore tangentially, is the fact that nation states are, let's say, less powerful and have less control, and alternative organizations, alternative collectives have more power. So right now that's corporations and banks, but it's also NGOs and
in 4chan and Slashdot and Reddit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
So things that motivate groups across nations. So, you know, a lot of this is happening online, and a lot of this is very nebulous. And what I hope to achieve, and there's some areas that I've locked down and some that I haven't, is to kind of go on, kind of be on the ground around the world, exploring stories and really kind of connecting them to people and issues. And I don't know if you ever watched that show on CNN, Anthony Bourdain, where he kind of goes around and meets a local. So if you're going to be my local and we were going to meet somewhere to try and explore, you know, the areas we've spoken about today, you know, private jets wherever in the world, you know, money, no options. Where would we go? Who would we meet? What would we go into Russia to try and find hackers? Would we be in China? Would we be in US, Washington?
Yeah, we'd take a trip to the village just north of North Korea in China, where the DPRK's hackers reside in a hotel, I understand. You know, we talk to them and see what their daily life is and what the grind is in their attacks that they engage in. We would definitely want to go to Nigeria and interview some of those brilliant 419 scammers who I've talked to one who went to college with one of them. And, you know, you have to realize the 419 scammers, the successful ones, are highly educated.
Yeah.
They really know what they're doing. So just because their emails look like they're not, that's just a filter to keep the smart people from responding, right? They don't want to trick smart people. They want to get the really dumb people who say, oh, yeah, I'll do that. Including myself in that list. Because
and I've definitely taken a trip on a plane to a meeting that I've worked out afterwards was shady.
Oh, yeah. Yep, been there, done that. But I'd also want to go to, you know, Helsinki, Tallinn, where they're really transforming an entire country into a digital nation in Estonia. Helsinki because of their digital privacy mentality. Love that. And you know, maybe parts of Sydney. There's a lot of cool stuff going on in Australia.
I'm talking to a few people there actually. It's
good.
to me that's the only time I've heard Sydney as a hotbed of tech is around blockchain.
Oh, okay. But there are some surprisingly great security companies that have come out of Australia. Tier 3 is still there. There was a packet capture company that was acquired by Arbor Networks out of Australia. You know, Australia is this wonderful little microcosm, right? Because it's you know, it's so small from a and you know, economic and population measure, but so widespread. You know, so they like have to colonize their own continent, right? Not everybody knows everybody in each profession, so it's great to visit.
Yeah, it's smaller cities like that have a lot of dynamism. Going back to DPRK, obviously there's been talk about them potentially launching cyber attacks. Any thoughts about that as a future threat?
Yeah, and in my list of countries to worry about, Iran and DPRK are high up on it because they literally have nothing to lose, right? They have nothing.
So one thing that never got me: how do they get these hackers when they don't have the internet? How do people instinctively know how to? I always think of hackers as people that grew up coding and know stuff inside out. How do they get them?
Yeah, you can train somebody who's computer savvy, which you don't have to be on the internet to become computer savvy. You can train somebody to be a good hacker in less than a year, and that's why they go to that village in China so that they can get internet access to execute their attacks.
Okay, and talk to me about Iran.
Yeah, you know, when it became public that the United States had engaged in Operation Olympic Games and had used Stuxnet in order to take down Iran's refining capability, that was, I mean, I can't imagine a worse slap in the face to the military, the intelligence agencies, and the government of Iran, right? You were completely humiliated by the United States. So shouldn't there be a proportionate response? And we haven't had one. We've had DDoS attacks against US banks, against their websites, did nothing to their ability to transact credit card stuff. There was an attack against Saudi Aramco, but that was an attack against Saudi Arabia, not us. So a proportionate attack would be causing a meltdown in a nuclear reactor. That would be about the right attack. So they've had going on 10 years to devise a response and engineer it. So always keep your eyes open for that.
Okay, that's scary stuff. We've been fairly wide-ranging, and I get a feeling I'd love to hit you up in the future again. But do you feel like, I've missed anything in the questioning that I should be aware of or we haven't touched on?
Yeah, there's one thing. So, you're talking about the impact of artificial intelligence and blockchain, cryptocurrencies.
We call it 4IR, Fourth Industrial Revolution tech, as a kind of catch-all.
Yeah, so you're missing the biggest one that's going to, because you did give me a 10-year time frame, and that's quantum computing.
Okay.
Quantum computing is almost impossible to imagine all the repercussions of what happens.
Okay.
And room temperature stable quantum computing, imagine in a handheld device where any calculation, any algorithm can be done instantaneously as far as we're concerned.
Okay. And the quantum computing, lots of people are saying, can break blockchain, which is what we're putting up as a
easy. Right now the motivator for, if you needed an economic motivation, so governments are doing quantum computing so they can break cryptography, right? And as soon as they have it, instantly all your keys belong to them. But if you were an entrepreneur, an Elon Musk or something, you would strive to get quantum computing first because you could do the hash calculations for Bitcoins and win every single race.
So this is like the nuclear race.
Yeah, completely. And the similar amounts of money, not in real terms, but in dollar terms, are being spent on it. Google's invested over $1 billion in it.
So I was speaking to someone on Friday, I think it was it Thursday? This clever kid who's an engineer and sold his first company when he was 14. He was saying he thinks there will be a response to quantum computing, i.e. you'll create a version of the blockchain on quantum computers or somehow use it. But I guess the scary bit is that potential 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15-year gap between everything catch up. So basically, blockchain is going to be great, but it's going to be a breather before we get not screwed again, but go through more turmoil.
Yeah. Though, so speaking of science fiction stories, everybody wonders, where did blockchain come from? Who is this Satoshi Nakamoto? So my theory is...
Your hand up?
Yeah, no. My theory is Satoshi came from the future. So he already knows the end game. He just needed to plant the seed with the white paper back here. So
okay,
so it's all going to be taken care of. Hopefully he's a good guy, not a bad guy.
Okay, well, I've got to say that, that's what excites me about this story, is there is this potential transformation to this. So the original catchphrase for this movie, or logline, was talking about the potential utopias and dystopias. Because right. I think, yes, we've got the tools of a crypto-authoritarian state where maybe corporations could rule it, but also we've got the tools where people own their data and they're generating income by being, acting, looking at Facebook,
yep.
creating a little bit, maybe working a little bit. But that relies on big data. It relies on a lot of these new technologies. And I do feel like the computing we've got so far, and tell me if this is a supposition you think is right or wrong, the computing we've had so far is taking existing system structures, ways of operating. I'm not going to say capitalism, but just, thinking back to the last 700 years post-feudal society. And we've kind of crammed it onto the internet, we've computerized it. But blockchain AI, quantum computing, allows us to inherently do things in a very different way, which is not based on nationalities or national governments or national sovereignty, but just ways that are inherently only possible on a computer. Inherently only possible on a computer. So we do things very differently.
I think that is brilliant and right on.
Okay.
I've watched us talk about the information age and the internet revolution for 20 years now, and yet, when I was in school and in my first job, man, I was using computers to simulate full-on car crashes and the dynamics of a vehicle, and I could tune a vehicle so it wouldn't vibrate at a certain frequency. I was really using computers in a cool way. And then we had the internet revolution, which was just a new presentation layer, right? It added, and we have only been trying to accommodate and adjust our world to new ways for humans to communicate, which is awesome, right? It's changed the world, no question about it. We're seeing some of the vulnerabilities that fake news and information operations can take advantage of that. We haven't even touched the computing part of it. What can we do if we can really, really have smart computers?
Yeah, I mean, it's scary. I was talking to another author called Jerry Smits, based in Belgium, who maybe I should introduce you to.
Yeah.
And the discussion we were having was, if we were 50 years in the future, looking back to today, would we even have what they consider to be the internet? Do we have this pre-thing?
Right.
This starter stage?
Yeah. Well, when you start thinking about biomedical, biohacking and the interfaces that we can have from our brain to everything else, that could happen, along with adding VR, immersive reality, that 5G, I believe, is going to make possible because the bandwidth will finally be there. So it's good. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, so I need to be doing more of a deep dive in quantum computing. Interestingly, I've got this tech show that I always watch called BBC Click. And they just happen to have a thing about quantum computing, so I've got to go to video on demand and watch it more deeply to get into the story. This has been really interesting. It's been a learning curve for me, which is always a pleasure, and I hope we get to talk again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Vlad. That was good.
Thank you.